Welcome to those of you joining online. We're just going to wait another minute or so just so everyone can get in the room. Last one in, close the door, please. Thank you all. Good morning and welcome to ABL's Maritime Market Briefing for March 2024. My name's Mark McGowan. I'm the Global Managing Director of Maritime here at ABL. Today we're going to be talking about the UK ports industry, but a few words from me first. So this market briefing is accredited by the Chartered Insurance Institute, and delegates can claim up to 1 CPDR for your participation. We will therefore keep a record of those of you in the room today and those of you logging in online. And if you haven't done so already, please make sure you sign in with the team on the desk outside after the briefing so you can make sure you receive the follow-up email and the certification if you need it. And as a quick reminder, again, this month we'll be ending the webinar portion of the briefing after the technical presentation, and the marine casualty case reports going forward will be only for those in the room here at Lloyd's. But if anyone would like any information on this after the briefing, they can feel free to contact us and we'll sort you out. I'm very pleased to introduce our technical presenters today. We've got two Daniels, so I'll get those first names right, if nothing else. Daniel Wood is a Master Mariner and Ports Consultant, and he's heading up our Ports Compliance and Loss Prevention Consulting Services. He's based here in the UK, and he's part of our global Ports and Harbours team. Based up in Edinburgh, but he's frequently down here in the London office with us, and he supports the development and the service offering in ports and harbours around the world. I've sailed with Daniel some 20 odd years ago, so I've known him for a long, long time, and we're very happy to have him on board. I'm very pleased to have him here presenting today and sharing his unique expertise on this topic with us. So the second Daniel Dolan, is new to the market briefing team, and he stepped in at the last minute because the original presenter had to go away on business. So thank you very much for stepping in at the last minute. Daniel is from our Renewable Energy Consultancy branch, OWC, and he specialises in wind energy, resource and yield assessment studies. So thanks very much and great to have you with us. The usual caveats apply, Chatham House rules apply, and please also remember, as always, that the information contained in these presentations and any opinions or comments expressed are those of the presenters and not necessarily those of ABL. At the end of today's briefing, we'll ask everyone to take a few minutes out of their day to complete the online survey. It's very important for us if you can manage to do this for us, because it helps with our CPD accreditation status and it allows us to continue offer the points that are available. It also, of course, means we can actively look on how we can improve on these briefings to match your requirements and needs. The QR code's also outside and we'll include it in an email afterwards. Before I hand over to Daniel, I'd just like to remind you all of this initiative that the ABL is a signatory to, the Neptune Declaration on Seafarer Wellbeing and Crew Change. Pretty much started as a COVID issue, and obviously we've moved on for that, but it's still an important aspect of ensuring that seafarers have access to the requirements that they need. Many of our own colleagues, including Daniel and I, come from a seafaring background, so here at ABL, seafarer welfare is very close to our hearts. If you have an opportunity to persuade those that need to in your companies to sign up to this, please do take a look. And if you've got any questions about it, please feel free to contact me afterwards. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Daniel for our technical presentation.
Okay, can you hear me all okay? Thanks very much, and thank you for attending. Just on terms of today's learning objectives, what we're going to do is look at the definition of a port, harbour and terminal and understand the legislative framework around ports and harbours and how those affect safety compliance. We're going to gain a deeper understanding of the governance of the UK ports industry and look at the development and origins of the Port Marine Safety Code. I'm going to help us identify the primary legislation around ports and harbours and how that legislative framework affects the complexities relating to safety compliance. And finally, we'll be able to look at the main sources of data in terms of ports and harbours safety statistics and where we can find them. So the UK ports industry. The UK, of course, is an island nation, and ports are the critical nodes of that island nation. Around 500 million tonnes of cargo, freight, and 65 million passengers are processed through UK ports annually. 95% of our imports and exports are handled through UK ports. That includes 40% of food requirements and 25% of energy requirements. But only 20 of the top UK ports account for 90% of that total freight. So those are critical nodes. The ports industry employs 126,000 people directly, and a recent study showed that the ratio is 1 to 6 of indirect employment. So that equates to around nearly 800,000 people. The industry contributes 37 billion to the UK economy. And once again, at a ratio of 1 to 2, this equates to over 70 billion. The industry is represented by 3 main bodies: the British Ports Association, and their membership covers around 86% of UK trade. The UK Harbour Masters Association has 470 members, representing harbour masters and commercial bodies in support of UK ports and harbours. And then finally, we have the UK Major Ports Group. These are 9 of the 10 major ports companies, and they represent 70% of the trade. So what is a port, what is a harbour, and what is a terminal? Well, a harbour is actually defined in the Harbours Act, and that means any harbour, funnily enough, either natural or man-made, and includes a port, a haven, tidal, estuary. It's got to be navigated by a seagoing vessel, though. Docks and wharves are also included in that definition. Ports are places within harbours where commercial activities take place. So this would mean the movement of cargo or the movement of passengers. It includes docks, wharves, terminals, jetties, and quays. And generally, ports are defined in legislation under customs legislation. In the UK, that's the Customs and Excise Management Act. So primarily for commercial purposes. In the pictures, the top one, the harbour, is Campbelltown, if you were wondering. So on the Scottish West Coast. And down the bottom is the Port of Leith. And that's where I hail from. But you probably knew that from my broad East Coast Scottish accent. But what is a terminal then? So a terminal is part of a port that actually deals with a specific trade. And we find around 6 main types of terminals. And you've probably heard of all of these: oil terminals, of course, or liquid bulk, container terminal, break bulk terminals, dry bulk, passenger, and of course, ro-ro. Terminals are not really defined in law, but are often referred to in a lot of our secondary legislation, which is quite interesting, and in industry standards. For example, the Oil Companies International Marine Forum will define an oil terminal as a place where tankers are berthed or moored for the purpose of loading or discharging petroleum cargo. There is no single definitive list maintained by the UK government of all the ports and harbours and marine facilities around the UK. An independent website called ports.org.uk lists 950 of these, but estimates maintain that this could be almost double, and of course is changing every day. Around 120 of those are cargo handling ports, and 51 of those 120 are what we term major ports. So they handle over 1 million tons of cargo annually. Harbours are managed by bodies called statutory harbour authorities, and they are responsible for the management and running of harbours. And all UK ports are statutory harbour authorities. There are 426 of them in recent UK government statistics. And in terms of ownership models, which I'll expand on in the next slide, 181 of them are privately owned, the majority. 170 are local authority owned, and 75 are designated as trust ports. So in terms of the governance, what does that mean? Well, a private port is privately owned and overseen by the owner's representatives. This is generally an executive board, and they are there to make profit. A good example, or the biggest one in the UK that handles 25% of the trade, is ABP. A local authority owned port is owned by the local authority, as it says. So generally we'd say the municipal port, easy for me to say, and that would be a board of the elected councillors or members. The biggest one in the UK is Portsmouth. And then finally, we have trust ports. So these are ports that are administered by trusts, and this is an independent statutory body, and that's set up in a local act for that port. And they have their own sets of rules. And basically, the money they make goes back into the port, and the role of the trustees is to ensure that that port exists for future generations and that it's improved. So quite a good model. We also have state-owned ports as well. So the Ministry of Defence, and you're probably aware of Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Clyde are Her Majesty's naval bases. We also have Marchwood down in Southampton for the British military, their merchant wing. We have the Environment Agency. They have 2 ports in Lydney and Rye. And also CMAL, Caledonian Maritime Assets Limited, which is Scottish government owned. They own 26 ports and harbours in Scotland. Outside of these statutory harbour areas, the competent authority is the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, and they are responsible for navigation in those waters up to 12 nautical miles, and we call that the coastal state. We also have something called competent harbour authorities as well. And those are harbour authorities that have been given statutory powers relating to the provision of pilotage in their waters. And this description was created in an act called the Pilotage Act of 1987. And there are 105 of these competent harbour authorities in the United Kingdom. All competent harbour authorities are naturally statutory harbour authorities. So a little bit about the Port Marine Safety Code. I'm sure we all remember these. This incident was the Sea Empress oil spill in Milford Haven. On the 15th of February, she was inbound. She was under pilotage, a large tanker. And unfortunately, due to a combination of factors, she grounded. And the subsequent oil spill was 72,000 tons of crude in a very unique and beautiful part of the world. It cost around 60 million, and in today's terms, probably 120 million to clean up, and some devastating impacts on the environment there. As is often the case in maritime, we go away and we look at this reactively. And so the Maritime Accident Investigation Branch, the body responsible for investigating maritime incidents and preventing their recurrence, investigated this incident. And a year later, they produced their report. They had 67 findings and they made 24 recommendations. But probably the most significant one was to the Department of Transport, or for Transport, it was termed differently then. And they had to go away and look at how they monitored competent harbour authorities. And what they did was they decided to review the Pilotage Act and see how that would, what they could find. And so they did this review for a year. And the outcome of that review was that the statutory harbour authorities, or the harbour authorities, should continue to monitor pilots, but that they wanted pilot operations to be more integrated into the management systems of the harbour authority. And they were really insistent on maintaining high standards in pilotage. And they proposed that a marine operations code for ports was developed. And this was to set a national safety standard for ports. There was actually nothing in the UK apart from all of these laws, these local laws. Create a guide for harbour authorities, so sort of to help them as well. And in order for them to set safety policies, in order to manage safety, they wanted harbour authorities to consult with local users because they found that they weren't doing this well, and produce plans, basically saying, this is what we're going to do in terms of safety, and measure themselves against those plans. So the Port Marine Safety Code was born, and this code sets out a national standard for port marine safety in the UK. Its aim is to enhance safety. It came out in 2000 and was made, it was implemented on the 1st of January 2002. And since then, it's undergone a number of iterations, normally every 3 years, the last one being in 2016, so they're kind of a bit late on that one. It's applicable to statutory harbour authorities, but since 2016, also to non-statutory harbour authorities. So this is really anything that you can think of that has marine function. So a marina, a terminal. So it applies to all of those. The UK government expects that they comply with the Port Marine Safety Code. There is a draft version out for consultation at the moment. It's going to be called the Ports and Marine Facilities Safety Code, and there's some changes that it's gone through, and that should be probably implemented in the next few months or so. The code is produced with something called the Guide to Good Practice on Port Marine Operations, or just the guide. It supplements the code and provides more technical, detailed information for harbour authorities in order to allow them to meet compliance with the code. It's got 13 sections, 8 annexes. But what's important to note is that compliance with the code and the guide are voluntary, so they're not mandatory. But what they do ensure is that harbour authorities have relevant policy that help them meet their requirements and provide assurance to the UK government that marine safety is being properly managed. The UK Port Marine Safety Code has its 10 commandments or 10 measures for compliance. And briefly, those include the designation, identification of a duty holder. So this is a body that is accountable for marine safety in the port. That duty holder has to then assign a designated person. So quite similar to designated person ashore under the ISM code. And this designated person provides independent assurance to the duty holder that they're meeting their requirements. So there's an independent assurance function. And you'll hear this word assurance mentioned quite often. The duty holder has to be aware of the legislation, and I'm going to expand on the legislation, how complex it is. And some of it goes back in some of the trust ports over 200 years. So, you go out to these ports to do an audit or a review, and you ask for their legislation. The harbour master kind of leans behind him and pulls out this massive old file and blows the dust off it, and we start looking through and finding out the limits of the harbour and all these fun things. And then the duty holder has to be aware of their duties and powers. They're required to have a formal risk assessment for the port to identify what hazards are there, and they have to manage these hazards. And they do this through a marine safety management system. So the risk assessment identifies the hazards, the safety management system then manages them to risks as low as reasonably practicable. There is a process or requirement for review and audit. This must be a continual and systematic process, and the designated person has a role in this. Competence, they want trained, experienced people in the roles that manage marine safety. And as I said, they must publish a plan. So that's got to be on a website, it's transparent and says to people, this is what we view as the most important requirements for meeting our obligations. And another requirement is that they measure their compliance against that plan every 3 years. Then finally, they have to have aids to navigation in place in line with the requirements of general lighthouse authorities. So that's all quite a mouthful. I think it's better to just sort of break it down into 5 main pillars. And these are sort of what I would look at if I was to go into a port in terms of, are they being compliant, these 5 areas. And really that is there a duty holder? Have they been published? Are they aware of their responsibilities? Is there a designated person? Is that person providing independent assurance to the duty holder? Has there been a risk assessment? Is it a formal process that they've used? Is there a safety management system in place to measure those risks? And have they consulted? And you remember when those initial requirements came out after the review of the Pilotage Act, consultation was the big thing at the end. Have you consulted with local stakeholders? And that is still quite challenging in some of the big ports, because they are so big and there are so many people with skin in the game or interest. So onto the legislative framework. So as I said, the code is voluntary, so it doesn't really contain any new legal obligations, but it does include references to main legal duties. And that's quite a weighty tome of them if you put them all together. So there's 25 primary acts that are referred to, pieces of legislation, 33 sets of regulations, 10 codes of practice, 16 standards, and 24 guidance documents. So quite a lot to know in a document that's only 34 or 35 pages thick. So that's not the route I took to get in here this morning. Okay, That's actually a very nice schematic that's been developed by the British Ports Association. They looked at the whole framework of legislation around ports and harbours and sort of they gave it a health rating, you know, does it need to be reviewed or anything like that? And the orange is referring to safety and the green obviously to environment. And you can see how sort of they really are quite prominent there. And that runs through the acts, the regulations, international obligations, and that's available on their website. So quite a nice schematic and easy way to, well, easy. It's at least all in one place. Probably quite interestingly is that a link can be drawn between the Health and Safety at Work Act, which is obviously a requirement from 1974 for organizations to have duty holders and manage risk. And this is primarily looking at the landside operations in a port and the requirements of the Port Marine Safety Code. And that link, I'll talk a little bit about how that link works, but the Health and Safety Executive is there and they do monitor the enforcement of the Health and Safety at Work Act with those landside operations. They've actually produced their own publication called Safety in Docks. This is an approved code of practice, and they've consulted with marine safety bodies in order to produce that. There was recently, probably a few years ago, a case where a port authority was prosecuted, and the judgment read that you failed to provide a safe system of work and that you failed to provide a safety management system. You didn't reduce your risks to a level as low as practicable. And this was in terms of marine operations. And you didn't do that in terms of the Port Marine Safety Code. You failed to appoint individuals or a person to be the designated person. So there was no one providing independent assurance to the duty holder. And that there was no audit as well. Prosecuted and fined. In terms of national ports legislation, and I spoke about, you know, those 23 different pieces of legislation, the primary one where it all stems from is the Harbours, Docks and Piers Clauses Act, 1847. So nearly 200 years old, and we still use that legislation. Isn't UK legislation a wonderful thing? And then various changes to that. Obviously, there's some aspects of devolution, the Dangerous Vessels Act, and a lot of these were precipitated by an event. And you could, if you look through some of those, you will know what the event was. Of course, the Merchant Shipping Act, and as I said, the Harbours Scotland Act for devolution in Scotland. So local legislation, so local acts and orders, and if you consider 75 different trust ports, that's 75 different pieces of legislation just for those trust ports. So they have orders as well in order to change their legislation. They also have things called bylaws, which are quite archaic, but useful if they're up to date and relevant. They regulate rather than prohibit, and that is activities all around the port estate, the land side as well, parking, all sorts of things. These have to be consulted on, and they're confirmed by a minister, so quite difficult to sort of get through, and people are moving away from bylaws now. There are special directions as well, so Harbour Master has special directions. This is drawn straight from that 1847 Harbours, Docks and Piers Clauses Act. So, and when we do audits in that, we always make sure that that clause is written into their local law so that they can actually give special directions to vessels, i.e. you can't go there, you need to moor here. So there you go. They have things called general directions as well. These are also allowed through local legislation, and this regulates movement and berthing of ships generally. And then recently they were brought in harbour directions under the Marine Navigation Act. And then harbour authorities can regulate the movement, mooring, equipment and manning of ships. So a little bit more technical in terms of what it has. So I spoke about those government entities. Department for Transport is overall responsible, obviously in the UK, for transport policy, and that's across all airports, rail and ports. Underneath the Department for Transport is the Maritime Coast Guard Agency. So they are an executive agency of the Department for Transport, and they're responsible for advising on the composition and application of the code. And they report directly to the Secretary of State for Transport. And they do this by conducting health checks. I'll speak about those in a bit. Monitoring the compliance of harbour authorities against the code, consultation between all these groups, and they need to produce an annual report on this as well. And also in any sort of technical assistance that DFT needs. Then we have the MAIB. So they sit under the Department for Transport, but they're a completely independent unit. And their role is to investigate incidents involving shipping in UK waters, so within the 12-mile limit, and also on any UK ship anywhere around the world, and prevent recurrence. So that is their primary obligation, just preventing the recurrence of incidents, not apportioning liability or blame or punishing. Different to the Health and Safety Executive, who are there to enforce the Health and Safety at Work Act. So they can come there to the port, and if the port authority is doing something wrong in terms of operations, cargo operations or containers, they can issue prohibition notices, they can investigate and issue fines. Environment Agency is also there as well, and they have requirements around railheads in ports, and then local authorities as well in terms of port health. So that is the full group, but there are many more as well. So we'll have a little look at safety statistics. So compliance is reported by each port authority to the MCA. So it's self-reported every 3 years. In 2016, I think there were only 152 that reported compliance out of that 400 odd. But the most recent round, which was 2022, 237 reported compliance. So that represents around just over 50% of ports reporting compliance. Those are only statutory harbour authorities. If you look at the big picture, and I said there could be possibly 1,700, that's probably only around 14%. So if you go around, we're sort of working in all these places, you can see that there is a lot of non-compliance around. Periodically, or following a major incident, the MCA will seek assurance that the organisation is meeting its obligations under the code, but they're also required to monitor levels of compliance through the year. And they do this through what they call a health check. So it's an intelligence-led investigation, and it's not, they can't issue prohibition notices or anything like that. They can only make recommendations or suggestions, and it's up to the port to accept them. They're required to do 8 of these a year, and generally they get through them. 8 is not a huge amount, and it's only 2% of statutory harbour authorities. They produce an annual report. Unfortunately, the last one was only produced in 2020, so there's still a backlog there. But they do run some statistics, and in order to sort of make it a little bit easier to understand, I've just broken it down into those 5 pillars, and you can see there that there is some sort of improvement in terms of the 5 pillars, but you'll note that non-conformance is relating to the duty holder and designated person are kind of on the increase, whereas safety management and risk assessment on the decrease. So while ports are getting better at assessing their risks and managing safety, there's this accountability question, and that is always all the way through. So there's always this question around accountability. Who is accountable? Do they know their obligations? But generally, if we look at the MCA statistics, and that, it's quite a small data set, compliance levels are steady at around 75% for those that they check. The HSE produces excellent statistics every year, and these are available on their website. They're available under the Freedom of Information Act. You can go and sift through the data for hours. I just took looking at fatal injuries per 100,000 workers. Now, it's important to note that ports, they extend over different of these sort of macro groups that the HSE looks at: construction, manufacturing. And these standard industry codes, it's quite difficult to pull this data out, because you've got container operations and transport in the port, and then marine operations, and fishing, and they're all sort of different. But in terms of fatal injuries, the HSE reckons that that trend is going down. There is an organisation called Port Skills and Safety, and they represent a lot of the major ports, and they produce excellent statistics and data, and this was gained open source. And you can see from there that in terms of their data, since the Port Marine Safety Code came in 20 years ago, incidents of injuries in ports are on the decrease as well. They tend to focus a little bit more on the sort of the land side in terms of the HSE, but they do look at marine incidents as well. Obviously, the MIB produce their reports, but the MIB don't necessarily look at marine incidents in ports specifically with data, but that can be extracted. Looking regionally, which is, because we were in the EU up until quite recently, so these are quite relevant as well. From 2014 to 2022, the European Marine Safety Agency produced a report. You can see the trend line is down, so incidents are decreasing. But what's interesting to note is that over half the incidents are in and around port areas, internal water sort of port areas. So 50% of incidents are taking place, and that trend is steady. So if there's an incident in the maritime world, 1 out of 2, it's going to happen within a port authority area. And recent consultancy statistics indicate that as well. So that's important to know in terms of risk profiles, that 50% of the time, if we have an incident, it's going to be inside a port. Thank you very much for your attention. Just want to recap on the learning objectives. I'll just leave them up there. And I'd like to go to the floor for any questions. Nothing? All learning objectives met? Everyone happy? Thanks very much for your attention. Nothing. Any questions for anyone online? No? Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. That's very interesting, informative. So we're going to say goodbye now to those of you who've joined us online on the webinar.